So I'm Adena Oliver. I'm from Ottawa, and my story is, I guess we're going to speak a little bit about my youngest daughter and her journey, and I guess I've more or less been along for the ride. But so basically, when I was pregnant with my third child, we went in for the ultrasound for the 20-week, neonatal testing. And we found out it was a girl, and we were very happy about that. But they did spend a lot of time going through some of the anatomy that they hadn't done on my previous pregnancies, and I kind of had the mother's gut feeling that possibly something was wrong. So that whole weekend, I sort of I worried about it, actually. And at my next meeting with my obstetrician, I said, I feel like something is up. And he checked and he said, your intuition was good. Your baby has a heart defect. So that kind of started a whole process of appointments, at least weekly, it felt like, meeting with specialists, meeting with all sorts of people. So it turns out our daughter had interrupted aortic arch, which basically meant that the aorta, there was a small kind of branch that went up to her head, and the rest of the aorta, which would have normally provided blood and everything to the rest of her body, was interrupted or closed. So she was okay as long as she was in the womb, because there's a temporary duct that bypasses the lungs that was kind of serving that purpose for her. But we knew that once she was born and started breathing, then the increased oxygen content of the blood would start to close that and would lead to some big problems. So we knew about this. We also knew that, or we found out that this kind of heart defect was a big marker for a genetic syndrome called 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, formerly known as DeGeorge syndrome, with her basket of symptoms. So we knew this was coming. The benefit, or maybe the drawback, is that you had about another 20 weeks to wait before you had to do anything about it. I mean, she was fine as long as until she was born. She was born at CHIO here in Ottawa, and they did more testing and realized that she was maybe a little bit more complicated than they had expected. So we were medevaced to sick kids when she was 7 days old. And then she had her open heart surgery at 8 days old. It was a very long process. It was longer than we expected, and we didn't get updates through the day. But we were mostly okay. We found out at the end of the surgery, when the surgeon came out, that after he had stopped her heart, cooled her body, put her on a heart and lung bypass machine, and after he had, very delicately repaired this tiny aorta, because the heart of a newborn is only about the size of a walnut, so anything connecting is smaller than that. So as soon as they had started the process of warming her back up and connecting everything, all of those sutures that he had just painstakingly put in broke, and so they had to go back and cool her back down, stop everything again, kind of restart the process. So that's why it took a little bit longer. We were terrified that this meant that they could burst again at any time. Obviously, they used a new box of sutures, but when we were waiting to see her after the surgery, after this entirely long day, we heard we hadn't been able to get in to see her yet. They said that she needed a little bit more stabilizing, helping her deal with the blood pressure and all that. So we were sitting there waiting to be allowed into the room. And we heard, a call for a cardiothoracic surgeon to the cardiac ICU, a call for the perfusionist to the cardiac ICU. Meanwhile, 3 years earlier, my father had passed away after open heart surgery. So in my mind, it was like, oh my gosh, it's happening again. Thankfully, it wasn't for her. And you always do feel for the family who did have to go through that, but she did have a couple of bumps and hiccups on her recovery route, but she was discharged 11 days after open heart surgery. She came home. Newborns are incredible little creatures that just seem to grow and heal so much. She was discharged with a feeding tube in her nose because she was having some difficulty swallowing after her open heart surgery. She, as part of her 22q, she has low immunity, and she had some other issues as well, so she was requiring medication every 8 hours. She got sick after 2 weeks of being home with, a cold, that for some babies would, be easy to get over, but for a lot of babies, heart patients especially, it's harder to get over. So in her first 3 months, I think she spent 43 nights in hospital. And nights in hospital are, you kind of go into this weird twilight zone where like the world is very small. It's limited to the 10 by 10 room or whatever that you happen to be in. And so that was kind of how our first 3 months with her was, trying to keep her away from anyone who might have a germ anywhere close to their body so that she wouldn't be hospitalized again. We returned to Sick Kids in Toronto for a heart catheter surgery where they were looking to push open some of the aspects of her heart anatomy just to make it easier. And then she had another one in January. And with those, she was able to, and with growing, because they do grow pretty well, then she was able to get over colds a lot better. But she still had a lot of ear infections. She had 12 ruptured eardrums in the first year of life, so she had ear surgery when she was just over a year old. Those ear tubes mostly worked, but one of them got pushed out by a big ear infection that she had a couple months later, so now she's missing an eardrum on the one side. She's had physiotherapists, occupational therapists, dietitians. She's seen ear, nose, throat doctor. Of course, she sees cardiology. She sees immunology, genetics, endocrinology because of low calcium. She is seen by the 22q clinic in Toronto. We just started with the 22q doctor in Ottawa here. And I'm probably missing a bunch more. But so the first year was quite medical. Now she is doing really well from a physical perspective. She loves doing gymnastics class. She's 3 years old now. She's in gymnastics. She loves swimming. She loves sharing yogurt with her siblings and so on. So it's really neat to see how far she's come in such a short time. She is a brave, happy little kid. Even, I wouldn't blame her if she never wanted to set foot in a hospital again, but she seems to love being with the people there. When we had to give medicine to the dog for her ear, she wanted to be right in there and helping. So she seems to have developed over the course of these years kind of an extra sense of compassion, I would say, even though she can't really communicate it that well. We're going through speech therapy at the moment. She does have a certain spark to her that I think is, maybe it's because of the 22q, maybe it's been enhanced by the 22q, but she's a neat little kid. So 22q is probably not as well known as it should be. They estimate that about 1 in 900 pregnancies have 22q. It's most often a spontaneous genetic microdeletion, but if you do happen to have 22q yourself, there's a 50-50 chance of passing it on to any children you may have. But 90% of cases, they think right now, are just spontaneous, not because of, anything you would have done. They do call it the second most common genetic syndrome after Down syndrome, which of course everyone knows about. It's harder to know about 22q because there's, I think, 180 different variations or phenotypes that can happen. So there's some who have cardiac issues, there's some who have kidney issues, there's some who have palate issues. There are immune system deficiencies, thyroid and hypothyroid deficiencies as well. So within those 180 things that can be affected, any one person might have a very different collection of what actually affects them. So because it's so variable, it's hard to diagnose, it's hard to catch. Some people have no medical focus in their life until they have their own child and realize that that child has 22q. They also think it's a very prevalent genetic factor for things like autism, ADHD. So there's more studies going on into that. The Salk Institute in California is looking into a lot of this right now. And so one of the, I think, important things is that you do get prenatal testing when you're going through your own pregnancies, just because, I mean, we were given the decision ultimately as to whether we wanted to continue with the pregnancy. We decided that we felt compelled to, but there are some people who have babies who are much more sick, I guess, who have a much worse prognosis, and my heart goes out to them because that's a harder decision. I think it's important for people to know about 22q because it is much more common than we expect. It's also important to know about it because I can walk into a clinic and mention that she has 22q and nobody knows. They think I'm a nurse or a doctor because I know more about it than they may have to. So awareness is a huge part of the syndrome. And I know that there's 22q at the zoo. So there's an international foundation, the 22q 11.2 International Foundation, who organizes these events at the zoo where people wear t-shirts and get together as a community. Because as you can imagine, when you find out that your tiny little baby has this genetic syndrome you've never heard of, you instantly start wondering what kind of quality of life they'll have. What are they going to do? Like, are they going to be in this highly medical situation for all of their life? So it's so important to see, grown-ups and teenagers who have, been diagnosed with this same genetic syndrome, but are still able to, have a lot of fun, contribute to their community, have families of their own. Yes. Not always, unfortunately, and within the social media groups, unfortunately, there are sometimes babies who don't make it or kids who don't. There is also a fairly important or significant percentage who will end up with learning challenges, they call them, or learning differences, and even schizophrenia as grown-ups. I think 30% of adults with 22q have schizophrenia as adults. But that doesn't always take into consideration the people who don't have a lot of medical issues as well. So sometimes the percentages might be a little bit different because there may be a lot more people with 22q who just have no way of knowing because they haven't had a giant medical crisis that needs talking to a doctor about. So these things are things to keep in mind. I'm a big fan of information is power, and I read every medical journal and article that I could get my hands on in the months before and after she was born, and so I found that gave me a lot of power and a bit more of a feeling of control over this situation that really I didn't have that much control over on its own, but the information aspect at least allowed me to have a bit more perspective when it came to everything. The other thing is that having a genetic diagnosis or a medical diagnosis really does open a lot of doors. So, when you need access to speech therapy or you need access to an ophthalmologist, having a diagnosis means that you don't sit and wait, for a doctor's appointment that you don't know actually will ever come in a timely manner. So having that diagnosis is also really important for our family.